Miss Marple and the Murder Among the Elite. Chapter 1. A Disturbance at Oakwell Manor. The village of Oakwell had long been the epitome of tranquility, a charming settlement tucked away from the bustling world beyond. Its quaint cobbled streets and ivy-clad cottages lent it an almost timeless quality. And at the very heart of this village stood Oakwell Manor, a grand house of weathered stone that had seen many a season pass, its windows gazing serenely over the rolling hills that surrounded it. Dr. Alistair Cheston, a retired physician, had lived in the manor for over 2 decades. He had come to Oakwell seeking solitude after a lifetime of arduous work in the city. Renowned for his wealth, his eccentricities and his rather particular habits, Dr. Cheston had become somewhat of a local figure, both admired and, in some circles, feared. His young wife, Margaret, though not entirely out of place in the social circles Oakwell attracted, seemed an enigma to those who knew her. Quiet, reserved and always somewhat distant, she had married the doctor some 10 years ago, and their union, despite the age gap, had been the talk of many a dinner party. It was one such evening that Miss Marple found herself invited to Oakwell Manor, though she had not been invited in the formal sense. No, she had simply accepted her niece's invitation to visit, and upon hearing that the Chestons were hosting a dinner, Miss Marple had offered to attend out of a natural curiosity. "Just to see how the other half live, my dear," she had remarked, with her characteristic smile to her niece, a twinkle in her eye. The dinner was a grand affair, as most gatherings at Oakwell Manor tended to be. The long dining table was set beneath the glittering crystal chandelier, and an assortment of guests had gathered, their conversations drifting lazily from the latest political developments to the very real advances in medical science. Dr. Cheston, of course, was the centerpiece of the evening, holding court at the head of the table, his booming voice the most authoritative in the room. Miss Marple, ever the observer, had settled herself near the far end of the table, content to listen and reflect. She was a woman of few words, but none of her guests had yet fully appreciated how sharply she observed everything that went on around her. The evening wore on, and with it, the heavy cloak of trivial chatter that seemed to envelop the room. It wasn't until the dessert course was being served that a sudden, blood-curdling scream shattered the conversation. The sound was so sharp, so filled with fear, that it seemed to hang in the air, suspended. All the guests froze for an instant. The room, previously warm and lively, was suddenly charged with a palpable tension. Then, without a word, everyone leapt to their feet, chairs scraping noisily against the floor, and rushed toward the source of the scream. Miss Marple, as ever, did not panic. Instead, she rose slowly from her seat, taking in the scene with an air of calm observation. The others were already crowded around the foot of the grand staircase. There, at the bottom, lay Dr. Alistair Cheston's body, a sharp knife protruding from his chest. His eyes were wide open in an expression of sheer surprise, though the rest of his features were frozen in death. The guests stood frozen in shock, none daring to approach. Miss Marple, however, stepped forward with her usual poise, small but sharp eyes scanning the room, the scene, and the people around her. "Everyone, please remain calm," she said, her voice clear and cutting through the rising murmur of fear. "Inspector Hale will be here shortly. Until then, we must not disturb the scene." Her words seemed to have a calming effect on the group, who stepped back to allow her a clear view. Miss Marple glanced at the body for a moment longer, her mind working swiftly, picking up details that might escape a less trained eye. There was no sign of a struggle. Dr. Cheston had not fought for his life, nor had he tried to run. He had fallen in a way that suggested he had been taken by surprise, but not by a stranger. No, this was far too methodical for that. The knife had been plunged into his chest with a controlled hand, and the angle was precise. It was a wound meant to end quickly. Who would want to harm such a man? Lady Isabel Grey, a woman of advanced years with a reputation for sharpness and quick wit, muttered from the doorway. Miss Marple turned toward her, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I believe we'll have an answer shortly," she replied cryptically, a glimmer of anticipation in her eyes. The guests stood together in an odd, tense grouping, casting furtive glances at one another. Margaret Cheston, her face pale, clutched her hands together as though she were trying to steady herself. She appeared utterly disoriented by the events, but Miss Marple, with her experienced eye, noted the slight tremor in her fingers. Was it fear or something else? A few moments passed before Lady Isabel spoke again, this time in a whisper that only Miss Marple could hear. "It's just like one of those stories in the papers, you know. The wealthy man, the beautiful wife, the murder. A tragedy." "Oh, indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice tinged with the softest edge of irony. "But the question remains, why? Why now? And more importantly, who among you knew that this night would end with such an unfortunate event?" Before Lady Isabel could answer, the sound of a car approaching the front gates signalled the arrival of the police. "Inspector Hale will want to speak to everyone," Miss Marple said as she turned her attention to the gathering crowd. "It is best we all remain where we are for the time being, don't you think?" The others nodded, the weight of the situation now settling over them like a shroud. The murderer was among them, and as Miss Marple stood quietly by the grand staircase, she could already feel the puzzle beginning to take shape in her mind. The game had begun, and Miss Marple was already several steps ahead of them all. Chapter 2. The Guests Gather. The stillness of Oakwell Manor was interrupted only by the crisp crunch of leaves underfoot as the police car rolled up the long gravel drive. The heavy door of the manor swung open, and out stepped Inspector Hale. Tall, with a stiff posture and an air of professionalism, he was a man of few words but swift action. He had worked in the area for many years and had become known for his methodical approach. A competent officer, yes, but one whose manner often bordered on the formal and the unremarkable. He wasted no time in addressing the gathered guests. "Everyone, please come forward and tell me where you were when you heard the scream," Inspector Hale directed, in a voice that lacked warmth but held the force of authority. Miss Marple, seated in a quiet corner of the room, observed the guests with a keen eye. She had long since learned that a great deal could be discerned simply by watching people, especially in moments of distress. She allowed the others to speak first, and as she listened, her mind began to turn, collecting the subtle nuances of each person's response. Margaret Cheston, the widow, was the first to step forward. She was pale, her face drawn and weary. As she recounted her account, she seemed more upset by the ruined dinner than by the tragic death of her husband. Her hands trembled slightly, but whether it was from grief or something else Miss Marple could not yet say. The woman's eyes darted about the room, never quite meeting anyone's gaze for long. "I was in the drawing room," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "I had just gone to check on the dessert when I heard the scream. I didn't know what to do. I ran out and found Alistair at the foot of the stairs." Her words were measured, but there was a certain distance to her tone, as if she were recounting events she had experienced from afar. She clasped her hands tightly in front of her, her knuckles pale with tension. Miss Marple noted that Margaret did not once look directly at the body during the retelling, though it stood only a few feet away, a stark reminder of her loss. Next, Harold Sutton, a former business partner of Dr. Cheston, was called forward. Harold was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, with a brash manner that made him difficult to ignore. He had been particularly vocal earlier in the evening about his frustrations with Dr. Cheston's recent business ventures. His quick temper and tendency to dominate a conversation had made it clear to Miss Marple that he was not a man who liked to be overlooked. "I was in the study, of course, with everyone else," Harold said loudly, perhaps a bit too loudly, as if he wished to project an air of certainty. "I was just finishing my glass of brandy when the scream came, straight out of nowhere like a bolt of lightning." He shook his head, his brows furrowing in exaggerated disbelief. "I ran straight to the hall, and there he was. Poor old Alistair." Harold's reaction struck Miss Marple as somewhat too eager. His response seemed to lack the natural progression of shock one would expect from a man who had just discovered the body of his old business partner. Instead, he seemed more intent on making an impression. Miss Marple's sharp eyes narrowed slightly as she pondered this. Was it too much of a coincidence that Harold had been in the study, the one room with no clear line of sight to the staircase? Or was his haste to appear helpful a sign of something else? Lastly, there was Eleanor Mason, a distant relative of Dr. Cheston's, who had arrived at the manor with little fanfare. Eleanor had spent much of the evening in quiet conversation with Margaret, their voices often lowered to hushed tones. Though she had seemed out of place among the more boisterous guests, her demeanour had always been polite, almost painfully so. When Eleanor spoke, her voice quivered with emotion. "I was in the garden," she said, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I went outside for some air after dinner. I couldn't bear to stay indoors any longer. It was so stuffy." She paused, gathering her composure. "I heard the scream and rushed in, but by then it was too late." Eleanor's distress seemed genuine, but Miss Marple noticed the subtle shift in her behaviour. Her hands, which had been clasped in her lap, now fidgeted nervously, and her breath came in shallow, quick bursts. Beneath the grief-stricken facade, Miss Marple detected something else. Perhaps a fear of being caught in a lie, or worse, a fear of something she knew but did not wish to say aloud. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple continued to observe, noting the little discrepancies in their stories. Harold's eagerness to distance himself from any responsibility, Margaret's detached recounting of events, and Eleanor's odd behaviour when she thought no one was looking. The more she watched, the more convinced Miss Marple became that the truth of the matter lay not in what was being said, but in what was left unsaid. In the midst of the hushed conversations, Miss Marple's thoughts were quietly formulating a theory, though she knew better than to speak it aloud just yet. There were too many layers to peel back, too many small inconsistencies to fully grasp the shape of the mystery. But she would wait. As always, time would reveal the truth, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that people's true natures, no matter how well hidden, were bound to slip through the cracks eventually. "I must say," Miss Marple remarked softly, almost to herself, "I do find it rather peculiar how grief can manifest itself in so many different ways." She glanced briefly at the guests, her words deliberate. "But we will learn the truth soon enough, I'm sure." Inspector Hale looked at her, not quite understanding the subtlety of her statement. But Miss Marple only smiled gently, her mind already several steps ahead. The guests, unaware of her keen insight, continued to talk among themselves. Little did they know Miss Marple was watching them all closely, ready to untangle the mystery they had all unwittingly woven. Chapter 3. The Secrets Behind Closed Doors. The night in Oakwell Manor grew thick with tension as the hours stretched on. The police had conducted their interviews with all the efficiency of an experienced team, but the guests remained agitated, their nerves raw from the shock of Dr. Cheston's sudden and violent death. Inspector Hale, a methodical man of few words, had quietly examined the scene and gathered the initial statements, but Miss Marple had seen enough. The question wasn't just who had murdered Dr. Cheston, but why and more importantly, how. The knife wound had been placed with care, almost too deliberately. The angle was precise, and there was no sign of a struggle. It was not the work of someone acting in a fit of rage, but a cold, calculated action. A professional, perhaps, or at least someone who knew what they were doing. Miss Marple's mind raced as she considered the possibilities. This was not a simple murder, it was far more complicated than that. She had learned long ago that the most significant clues often lay not in what was spoken, but in what was left unsaid. She excused herself from the drawing room, where the guests still gathered in hushed conversations, and made her way toward the library. There, seated at the window, was Margaret Cheston. Her eyes were distant, staring into the night, and her posture was stiff, as though she were trying to hold herself together. The pale light from the full moon bathed her face, casting deep shadows under her eyes, accentuating the exhaustion that seemed to weigh her down. Miss Marple approached quietly, as was her way. She did not wish to intrude, but knew that sometimes people revealed their truths only when they felt safe. Margaret did not acknowledge her presence immediately, but after a moment, her voice broke the silence.
"I'm so sorry, Miss Marple," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't understand. Why would anyone want to harm Alistair?"
Miss Marple sat down beside her, her movements slow and measured. She had seen much in her time, and though she had learned that people were often more complicated than they seemed, there was something about Margaret that made her particularly intriguing. "My dear, when you've lived as long as I have, you learn that people often don't reveal their true feelings," Miss Marple replied softly. "But the truth always finds a way of coming out one way or another. Dr. Cheston had more than a few enemies, didn't he?" Margaret's face hardened as she turned away, her fingers clutching the fabric of her dress. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice sharp now, betraying a sudden defensive edge. Miss Marple studied her closely, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "I don't mean to pry," she said gently, "but Dr. Cheston wasn't exactly beloved by everyone. He had made a few enemies in his business dealings, had he not? There were those who might have been very much interested in the fortune he had acquired." Margaret's face flickered with something unreadable, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned back toward the window, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clasped them together in her lap. "He wasn't always the easiest person to live with," Margaret said slowly, almost as though she were confessing. "He had his own ideas about how things should be done. He wasn't one for compromise." Miss Marple nodded in understanding, though her eyes never left Margaret's face. "Indeed," she said, her voice warm yet firm. "And you, my dear, were not always his greatest admirer, were you?" Margaret flinched, her shoulders stiffening. She turned to Miss Marple with wide eyes. "That's not true," she protested, her voice a little too high-pitched. Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile, one that reached her eyes. "Oh, I'm sure it's not, but let's just say I am not surprised someone had a motive." She studied Margaret's reaction with the same quiet patience she had developed over the years. It was always in the subtle changes, the way a person's breath caught, the way their gaze darted briefly before they covered it up, that Miss Marple found her most telling clues. Margaret let out a long, weary sigh. "You don't understand, Miss Marple," she said, her voice now small, almost fragile. "It wasn't just his business. He had a way of making people feel small, even me. I didn't always agree with his decisions, and sometimes I wondered if I was just a part of his collection, something to show off to his friends, but I never wanted him dead." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression one of quiet understanding. "Of course not," she said. "But sometimes the tension between people, The unspoken resentments, the feeling of being trapped, can lead to unexpected consequences. And in this case, Margaret, it seems there was far more beneath the surface than anyone was willing to admit. Margaret's face softened and her gaze shifted downward, avoiding Miss Marple's probing eyes. "I didn't want this," she whispered. "But I didn't know how to get out of it. He didn't make it easy." Her voice trailed off and she fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air between them. Miss Marple, ever the patient listener, did not rush her. Instead, she let the silence linger, knowing that sometimes silence spoke louder than any words ever could. When she finally rose to leave, she placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Think carefully about your own feelings, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "Sometimes the most honest answers come when we stop lying to ourselves." Margaret did not respond, but her shoulders slumped in what seemed to be the beginning of a weary surrender. As Miss Marple walked out of the library, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. She had learned enough for now, though the puzzle was far from complete. There were still too many pieces to fit together, and in time, the truth would emerge. But for now, Miss Marple could only observe and wait for the threads of this tangled web to unravel. Chapter 4. The Whispering Guests. The following morning, after a restless night in her own room, Miss Marple had decided to take a more direct approach. She had observed Harold Sutton's nervous pacing the evening before, and she had heard whispers about his financial troubles. The rumour mill in Oakwell was quick to churn, and Miss Marple had caught mention of Sutton's hope to inherit a portion of Dr. Cheston's considerable wealth, a portion he had been denied. Such desperation could drive a man to desperate actions, and it was not beyond the realm of possibility that Harold Sutton's strained relationship with Dr. Cheston had culminated in something far more sinister. Miss Marple found him in the drawing-room early that morning, pacing back and forth by the large, arched window. The early light caught his profile, and for a moment Miss Marple observed him in silence. He looked dishevelled, his usually immaculate suit wrinkled from a restless night. His hand rubbed his jaw absently, and his eyes darted nervously whenever they met anyone else's gaze. She stepped into the room with her characteristic quiet grace, drawing his attention. "Ah, Mr. Sutton," she said, her voice a gentle interruption to his agitated thoughts. "I've been meaning to ask you a question." Harold stopped mid-step, turning toward her with a forced smile. "Oh, Miss Marple. Good morning. I didn't expect to see you up so early. You must have had a long night after, well, everything that happened."
"Indeed," Miss Marple replied calmly, her gaze never leaving him. "I wanted to ask you, Mr. Sutton, you and Dr. Cheston, were you truly friends?" Harold's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "Of course we were," he said a little too loudly, his voice betraying a hint of defensiveness. "Or at least we used to be. We had our disagreements, but that's normal for business partners, isn't it?"
Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch for a moment before responding. Her eyes were sharp, studying his every movement. "Disagreements, yes," she said softly, her tone even. "I've noticed that you two didn't always see eye to eye, particularly when it came to the future of the Cheston Foundation. There was talk of a rather heated dispute between you over its direction." Harold shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. He took a deep breath, as though considering his next words carefully. "I may have disagreed with some of Alistair's decisions," he admitted, his voice tight. "But murder. That's not who I am." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her eyes remained sharp, never leaving him. "Of course not," she said, with an air of understanding. "But, Mr. Sutton, you must understand that there are many ways to kill someone, and it's not always with a knife. Harold's eyes widened, and for a split second, Miss Marple caught the flicker of something. Fear, perhaps, or something closer to guilt. He quickly recovered, however, and forced a laugh that sounded somewhat hollow. "I think I'm a bit confused, Miss Marple. I mean, I understand your point, but really, are we going to suggest that I had anything to do with it?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Sutton," Miss Marple replied, her voice as calm as ever. "But I do know that a great deal can happen behind closed doors. People can act in ways they would never openly admit. You must understand the stakes were high. You were closely involved in Dr. Cheston's business, weren't you?" But Harold's jaw clenched and he looked away, his hand returning to his chin as if deep in thought. His movements were agitated now, his earlier composure slipping away. "I told you," he muttered. "We had our differences. I didn't want him dead, not like that. No one could have predicted." He trailed off as though suddenly realizing how much he had already revealed. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if waiting for him to continue. Her silence, rather than pressuring him, only seemed to unsettle him further. "Sometimes," Miss Marple said at last, her voice quiet and thoughtful, "when a person is backed into a corner, when everything they've worked for seems to be slipping through their fingers, they may make a rash decision. Desperation can lead people to do things they would never normally consider. And perhaps you, Mr. Sutton, were not the only one who stood to lose if Dr. Cheston's decisions were allowed to continue." Harold looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice harder now. "I'm merely saying that sometimes the truth isn't what we want it to be," Miss Marple replied with a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You were certainly not the only one who had a stake in the Cheston fortune. But I do believe you were among those who might have felt the most pressure." Harold stood up abruptly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I don't know what you think you're insinuating," he said, his voice tight, "but I don't have to stand here and listen to this." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Of course, Mr. Sutton, but I would suggest you reflect carefully on the events of last night. Sometimes the truth can reveal itself in unexpected ways." Harold turned on his heel and left the room, leaving Miss Marple alone in the quiet drawing room, her thoughts continuing to churn. It was clear to her now that everyone at Oakwell Manor had their secrets, and each of them had something to hide. The puzzle was beginning to form, but there were still many pieces to be placed, and in time, Miss Marple would be there to fit them together. As the door clicked shut behind Harold, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet sigh. The game was afoot, and soon she would have the answers she sought. Chapter 5. A Hidden Love Affair. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured garden of Oakwell Manor, its golden rays dappling through the leaves of the ancient oak trees. The tranquil setting belied the tension that hung in the air, an undercurrent of unease that had settled over the estate since Dr. Cheston's murder. Miss Marple, ever observant, had spent the morning watching, listening, and quietly noting the behaviour of the guests. She had already observed much, but was keen to see what more might be revealed. Her thoughts turned to Eleanor Mason. The quiet, reserved woman had spent most of the evening speaking with Margaret Cheston, in whispered tones, their words often hidden behind the clinking of silverware and the hum of dinner conversation. Eleanor had seemed out of place among the more boisterous guests, but there had been something in her manner that had piqued Miss Marple's interest. The doctor's murder was no accident, and Miss Marple was beginning to wonder just how deep the web of secrets stretched. It wasn't long before she found Eleanor alone in the garden, standing by the stone fountain, her eyes fixed on the water as though it might offer her some solace. When Eleanor saw Miss Marple approaching, she tensed, her posture stiffening. Her eyes darted briefly to the side before meeting Miss Marple's with an unreadable expression. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see you here," Eleanor said, her voice faltering slightly as she smoothed the front of her dress with nervous hands. "I'm sure the police will find the culprit soon. I mean, it's terrible. Absolutely terrible." Miss Marple smiled gently, her expression calm and reassuring. "Yes, it's a dreadful thing, Eleanor, but sometimes we must look beyond the surface, don't you think? The body has been examined, and yet there are still questions that remain unanswered." Eleanor's face stiffened, a flash of something, fear perhaps, passing through her eyes before she quickly masked it. "Questions," she repeated, her voice a little too high-pitched. "Yes," Miss Marple continued, her voice thoughtful but measured. "You see, I've been thinking about your relationship with Dr. Cheston. Last night at dinner, you seemed very familiar with him, almost too familiar. It struck me that you had a rather personal connection to the late doctor, didn't you?" Eleanor's face drained of colour. She took a small, startled step backward, her eyes widening. "What are you implying?" Her words were clipped, her breath quickening. Miss Marple let the silence linger for a moment, her keen gaze never leaving Eleanor's face. "It's quite clear to me that your feelings for Dr. Cheston went beyond the typical family tie," she said softly, her tone gentle but insistent. "You were in love with him, weren't you?" Eleanor's breath caught, and for a long moment she was silent, her eyes fixed on the ground. Her fingers fidgeted nervously at her side, twisting the edges of her handkerchief in her hands. Then, with a reluctant sigh, she nodded.
"Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes, I was. I tried to keep it a secret. I knew it was foolish, but I couldn't help how I felt. When Alistair became engaged to Margaret, I was heartbroken. I had hoped, foolishly, that one day he might choose me, that he might realize, but he never did."
Miss Marple listened carefully, her expression one of quiet understanding. Eleanor's confession, while poignant, did not surprise her. She had suspected as much. The depth of Eleanor's feelings for Dr. Cheston explained much of her strange behaviour. It was clear now that Eleanor's grief was not solely for the loss of a family member, but for a love unrequited, a hope dashed. "I see," Miss Marple said softly, her voice full of sympathy. "It must have been difficult for you, Eleanor, to watch someone you cared for so deeply turn away from you, but love can be a powerful force, and sometimes it blinds us to the truth. The pain of unreturned affection can drive people to act in ways they would never normally consider." Eleanor's eyes flickered with something unreadable, a mixture of sadness and something else that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. "I never wanted to harm Alistair," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "Never. He was always so kind to me. But when I saw him with Margaret, I couldn't help but feel angry, I suppose. Angry at myself, angry at him, at the way he could just so easily discard me, but I would never have hurt him." Miss Marple nodded, her expression remaining calm, though her mind was racing. Eleanor's words were telling, but there was something more here, something that was just out of reach. She had confessed her love, her sorrow, but Miss Marple's instincts told her that Eleanor's feelings were far more complicated than simple heartbreak. There was something about her tone, the slight hesitation before the last few words, that made Miss Marple wonder if Eleanor was holding something back. "You're sure of that?" Miss Marple asked gently, her voice soft but insistent. Eleanor looked away, her gaze momentarily drifting toward the garden, as though the question had caught her off guard. She blinked, as if coming back to the present. "Of course," she said, her voice steadier now. "I never wanted to hurt him. I didn't even want to come here, but I had nowhere else to go, and I thought perhaps I could find some closure. I thought that if I saw him one last time, I might be able to let go of this foolish love." Miss Marple studied her for a moment longer, noting the way her hands trembled and the faint flush on her cheeks. "Yes, I understand," she said finally. "Sometimes we all carry burdens, Eleanor, and sometimes those burdens are too heavy to bear. But the truth, as always, has a way of revealing itself, even when we think it's well hidden." Eleanor didn't respond, but Miss Marple could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself as though bracing for something more. Miss Marple rose slowly, placing a gentle hand on Eleanor's arm. "I think, my dear, it would be wise to reflect on everything that has happened," Miss Marple said. "There are more answers yet to be found, but in time they will come, and then perhaps you will be free of the past." Eleanor's eyes lingered on Miss Marple for a moment before she gave a small, hesitant nod. Miss Marple, ever so gentle, walked away, her mind whirring with the complexities of the case. She had learned much, but there were still many questions to answer, many pieces to fit into the puzzle. Chapter 6. A fragment of truth. The atmosphere in Oakwell Manor had grown stifling, the weight of Dr. Cheston's tragic death pressing heavily on every guest. The house, once a place of jovial conversation and warm laughter, now felt empty and tense. Each room seemed filled with the sound of hushed whispers, but none of the guests seemed willing to say anything of real substance. Inspector Hale had conducted his interviews with his usual efficiency, but there were no clear leads, no definitive answers. It was as though the truth was hiding behind a fog, just out of reach. Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, had refrained from revealing any of her thoughts. She was careful not to give too much away. After all, it was the guests who had yet to show their true colours. But in her heart, she could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. She had spent much of the morning reflecting on the events of the previous evening, and had made several observations that left her with more questions than answers. In particular, Eleanor Mason's behaviour had struck Miss Marple as peculiar. The way Eleanor had looked at Margaret Cheston with an almost guilty expression during dinner, the way she had hurriedly excused herself from the table shortly before Dr. Cheston's death, it was all too convenient, too calculated. Miss Marple had sensed that there was something Eleanor was not sharing, and that evening's dinner had only heightened her suspicions. It was with this in mind that Miss Marple invited Eleanor to join her for tea in the drawing-room that afternoon. Eleanor had been quieter than usual, withdrawn, and Miss Marple thought it was the perfect opportunity to approach her without the prying eyes of the other guests. With a soft smile, Miss Marple poured tea with her usual grace, the silver spoon clinking against the cup as she stirred. She could almost feel Eleanor's nerves, the way her hands trembled slightly as she took her seat. "I know this must be terribly hard for you, my dear," Miss Marple began, her voice calm, soothing. "Such a loss. But I can't help but wonder, Eleanor, were you close to Dr. Cheston?" Eleanor's face went pale at the question, her gaze dropping to the tea in her hands. She clasped her fingers tightly together in her lap, as though to steady herself. I suppose I was," she said hesitantly, her voice faltering slightly. "He was a very dear man. I've known him for years. He was like family to me." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. The hesitation in Eleanor's voice did not escape her notice. "Did you visit him the night of the murder?" she asked, her tone casual, almost conversational, yet her eyes were sharp, watching every subtle shift in Eleanor's expression. Eleanor's breath hitched at the question, and for a moment Miss Marple could see the flicker of something, a flash of panic, perhaps, pass over her face. She quickly masked it with a small, nervous laugh. "Oh no, Miss Marple," Eleanor said, her voice strained but composed. "I was in my room all evening, grieving, of course. It was just so sudden, I didn't know what to do with myself." "I see," Miss Marple said softly, setting her cup down with a deliberate clink. "And yet, my dear, there's something I can't quite place. You seemed so familiar with Dr. Cheston at dinner last night. You appeared to know him quite well, and there was a certain—" Miss Marple paused for effect, then finished. "Affection in the way you spoke to him." Eleanor shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her lips parted, then closed again, as though she were searching for the right words. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple," she said, her voice quivering slightly. "I admired him, of course. He was so accomplished. But that's all it was, just admiration." Miss Marple studied her quietly for a moment, letting the silence stretch. "Yes, of course," she said at last, her voice gentle. "But sometimes, Eleanor, admiration can mask deeper feelings, and sometimes those feelings can lead to actions we wouldn't ordinarily take." Eleanor's gaze dropped to the floor, her fingers tightening once more around the teacup. Miss Marple could see that she was struggling with something, the weight of unspoken words pressing on her chest. Miss Marple had a feeling that the truth was very close, but Eleanor wasn't ready to reveal it yet. She would wait. "There's no need to say anything more, my dear," Miss Marple continued kindly, her tone warm. "Sometimes grief makes us do things we regret, things we might never consider otherwise. I can only imagine how difficult it must be for you." She paused, her eyes searching Eleanor's face. "But remember, Eleanor, secrets always have a way of coming to light, and it is never too late to tell the truth." Eleanor gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Miss Marple's words had touched something deep within her, something she wasn't ready to confront. The young woman looked away, blinking rapidly, but Miss Marple could see that the seed of doubt had been planted. "I'm sure the truth will come out in time," Miss Marple added, her voice soft but carrying an undercurrent of certainty. "But for now you must take care of yourself, and if you need someone to talk to, you know where to find me." Eleanor didn't answer, but as Miss Marple rose to leave, she glanced back, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's for the briefest moment. In that fleeting second, Miss Marple saw it, a fragment of truth, a reflection of something Eleanor was too afraid to face. As Miss Marple walked out of the room, she felt the puzzle pieces begin to align, though the full picture was still just out of reach. She would wait. The truth, as it always did, would come to light. Chapter 7. Strangers in the Dark. The days following the murder of Dr. Cheston were heavy with silence and veiled conversations. Oakwell Manor, once a sanctuary of quiet elegance, had become a prison of secret. The guests, who had once mingled freely, now kept to their rooms or gathered in small, tense groups, their voices hushed as they exchanged furtive glances. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion, and despite the relentless probing of Inspector Hale, no concrete evidence had emerged. He had narrowed down his list of suspects, but each person seemed to have an alibi, and no one appeared to have a motive that was immediately apparent. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily dissuaded. She had spent the past few days observing the guests with her usual keen eye, noting their subtle behaviors, the way they interacted with one another, and the small inconsistencies in their stories. In her experience, people rarely told the whole truth, especially when their actions had been less than honorable. She had come to one conclusion: someone was lying. That evening, as the guests gathered in the library, a place of warmth and light where the shadows of suspicion seemed to retreat, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap. The room was filled with a low murmur as the others discussed the ongoing investigation, but Miss Marple paid little attention to the polite chatter. Instead, she kept her eyes trained on the individuals around her, studying them quietly, as she always did. Her attention was soon drawn to a conversation unfolding near the fireplace between Harold Sutton and Lady Isabel Grey. Miss Marple had observed them both carefully over the past few days, and she had noticed the way Harold's brash confidence often hid a nervous energy, while Lady Isabel's outward composure always seemed to veil something more calculating. The two were speaking in low voices, but Miss Marple, with her sharp hearing and instinctive understanding of human nature, was able to catch snippets of their conversation. "I never liked the man," Harold was saying, his voice slightly raised, perhaps too much so for the tone of the conversation. "He had a way of making people feel small, you know, always putting others down, making them feel insignificant. But even so—" He hesitated, glancing quickly around the room before continuing. "It's hard to imagine anyone actually wanting to kill him." Lady Isabel nodded, her face a picture of sympathy, but Miss Marple could see the faintest flicker of something else in her eyes, a look that quickly disappeared behind her usual mask of politeness. "Isn't it funny, though," Lady Isabel added with a forced laugh, "how people react when faced with such a tragedy? Some pretend to be sad, others don't seem to care at all." Miss Marple's ears pricked up at the remark. The words were casual, but there was an undercurrent of something more in Lady Isabel's tone. It was almost as if she were distancing herself from the emotion that should have been present in such a statement. But what did it mean? Miss Marple's mind raced as she tried to piece together the implications of their conversation. Harold, ever eager to talk, seemed oblivious to the subtext of Lady Isabel's comment. Exactly, people like that pretending to care when really they couldn't care less. I mean, honestly, who would go so far as to— He stopped mid-sentence, as though realizing he had said too much. Lady Isabel glanced quickly at Miss Marple, who was sitting quietly in the corner, her knitting needles moving steadily in and out of the yarn. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and in that instant, Miss Marple felt the distinct chill of something being concealed. The conversation, which had seemed to turn innocuously enough, now took on a more sinister tone. Lady Isabel broke the silence with a small cough and a forced smile. "Well, we should all try to stay calm. The police will find the culprit soon enough," she said, her voice soft and even, but her eyes betraying a flicker of anxiety. Miss Marple nodded and returned to her knitting, though her mind was far from the delicate pattern she was creating. She had learned much in the last few minutes. The way Harold had spoken about Dr. Cheston was revealing. It wasn't just resentment, but a certain level of indifference, even callousness. And Lady Isabel's comment, so artlessly placed, so offhand, had given Miss Marple pause. The remark about people pretending to care was something one might say when trying to distance oneself from the emotional turmoil of a tragedy. Was Lady Isabel trying to distance herself from the murder in particular? It was clear to Miss Marple now that there was a link between Harold and Lady Isabel, something that went beyond mere acquaintanceship. But what was it? And why had they both chosen to speak so candidly in front of others? It was as though they were testing the waters, seeing who might overhear, who might be listening. Miss Marple waited patiently as the conversation continued around her. She had learned enough for now. Both Harold and Lady Isabel had revealed more than they intended. But there was still much to discover, and Miss Marple knew better than to confront them directly. She had to gather more pieces of the puzzle before she could make any conclusions. The evening wore on, but Miss Marple felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had caught a glimpse of the truth, buried beneath layers of pretense and fear. And though she could not yet see the entire picture, she was certain of one thing. The murder of Dr. Cheston had been no random act of violence. It was something far more deliberate. And the people in this house, strangers in the dark, knew far more than they were letting on. Miss Marple had only to wait a little longer, and when the moment was right, the truth would emerge. Chapter 8. The Final Revelation. The evening had arrived, a quiet stillness settling over Oakwell Manor as the guests gathered in the drawing room. The usual hum of conversation was absent. Instead, the room was thick with the weight of anticipation. The tension was palpable, as if every person present knew that the final piece of the puzzle was about to be revealed. The air was thick with uncertainty, but Miss Marple, ever composed, stood by the window watching them all with an unwavering gaze. She had spent the last several days observing the guests, listening carefully, piecing together the fragments of their stories, their half-truths, their lies. The guests were unsettled, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, casting furtive glances toward one another. They had no way of knowing that Miss Marple had already unravelled the threads of their deception, and that the time for answers had arrived. As the last of the guests settled into place, Miss Marple turned to face them. Her calm presence seemed to fill the room, and for a moment the silence stretched. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls, but it was Miss Marple who commanded the room's attention. "The puzzle is nearly complete," she said, her voice as steady as ever. "There are pieces here that don't fit, and I intend to find out why." She paused, her sharp eyes scanning each of the guests in turn. Lady Isabel, Harold Sutton, and Eleanor Mason. Their faces, strained with the weight of secrets, were all too telling. Miss Marple could see it. Each one of them had something to hide, and they believed they could keep it buried beneath layers of politeness, of grief. But Miss Marple had been watching, and now she was ready to speak the words that would bring the truth into the light. "I've spent the last several days observing you all," Miss Marple continued, her tone now firm, as if the very weight of her words carried the weight of 1,000 truths. "And something has become painfully clear. You are all connected by secrets, secrets that you have carefully hidden, hoping no one would see through the cracks." Lady Isabel's eyes flickered, and Harold shifted uncomfortably, his posture tense, as if bracing himself for something he had known, deep down, was coming. Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap, and her gaze darted nervously from Miss Marple to the others, as if trying to decide whether to flee or to face the inevitable. Miss Marple let the silence settle in the room. She knew what had to be said, and she knew that each of the three suspects, had a role to play in this twisted tale. They had all been complicit in Dr. Cheston's death, but the truth was more complicated than a simple motive of greed or revenge. "The murder of Dr. Cheston," Miss Marple said slowly, her voice soft yet full of conviction, "was not the result of a singular, violent outburst. It was planned. The motive wasn't greed, as some of you may have thought. It was love." Eleanor's face went a deep shade of crimson, her breath catching in her throat as the truth was finally spoken. The room seemed to close in on her, the weight of Miss Marple's words sinking in like a stone dropped into still water. "You see," Miss Marple continued, her gaze now fixed on Eleanor. "Eleanor Mason, you were in love with Dr. Cheston, and when you learned he was about to marry Margaret, you lost control. But what you didn't expect was that your actions would drive others to become involved." Eleanor's eyes welled with tears, and her trembling hand struggled to form the words she so desperately wanted to say, but they caught in her throat. Miss Marple's gentle but sharp eyes never wavered, watching her closely. Miss Marple took a step forward, her voice never rising above a soft whisper. "But it wasn't just Eleanor who had a motive," she said, turning her attention to Harold. Harold Sutton had his own. He was desperate for the Cheston fortune, and when he discovered that Eleanor had failed in her efforts to win Dr. Cheston's affections, he thought he could use her as a cover for his own crime. He attempted to manipulate the situation, framing Eleanor, hoping that he would be seen as an innocent bystander. Harold's face had drained of colour, his lips pressing together in a tight, angry line as Miss Marple's words struck home. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. "And Lady Isabel," Miss Marple said, her voice still calm but filled with quiet authority. "Your role was that of a silent conspirator. You knew about the affair between Eleanor and Dr. Cheston, and you tried to steer suspicion away from Harold and Eleanor by pointing to Margaret. You believed that by doing so, you could cover your own involvement in the plot." Lady Isabel's mouth parted, as if to deny the accusation, but Miss Marple's unwavering gaze silenced her. The room was thick with the weight of truth, and Lady Isabel's defences crumbled as she looked away. "The truth," Miss Marple said softly, her voice barely above a whisper now, "is that they all had their part to play. But in the end, it was Eleanor's guilt that led to the final unmasking." Eleanor broke down in tears, her sobs shaking her entire body as the truth finally came to light. I never meant for any of it to happen," she cried, her words coming in ragged gasps. "I loved him so much, and when he chose Margaret, I just couldn't bear it. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Inspector Hale, who had been watching Miss Marple with rapt attention, nodded in agreement. "You've solved it, Miss Marple," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "The murder was not just one person's doing. It was a series of desperate actions tied together by a web of jealousy, greed, and unrequited love." As Eleanor's confession echoed through the room, the guests sat in stunned silence. The weight of the truth hung heavy, and yet there was a strange sense of release. The secrets had been exposed, the lies unravelled, and in the quiet aftermath, justice had finally found its way. Miss Marple's work was done, and though the truth had come at a cost, it had set the course of events right. The room, once filled with suspicion and dread, was now calm, its mysteries solved, its secrets laid bare. Epilogue. As the guests departed Oakwell Manor, Miss Marple stood by the fire, contemplating the case. She had solved another mystery, but she never lost sight of the underlying truth. People's hearts were often more complex than their actions. Behind every murder, there were stories, motivations, and untold secrets. "You were right, Miss Marple," Lady Isabel said softly, approaching her. "You always seem to know what's going on." Miss Marple smiled gently. "It's all a matter of observation, my dear. People are rarely as clever as they think they are. And sometimes the truth is hidden in plain sight." And with that, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, content in the knowledge that justice had been served once again.